Hi, I'm Liz Pole, and I'm from Labour Coast&Country and representing Devon on the South West Regional Executive Committee. And the theme for this session is winning in 2021 and beyond, and is going to focus on what coastal and rural CLPs need from the party to win. So I just wanted to say a few words. When I got involved in the Labour Party in Devon a few years ago, in a constituency that reaches from Lyme Regis at the Dorset border, on the south coast to the foothills of Exmoor, it frankly felt like a hopeless, slightly pointless token exercise, perhaps a chance to meet some interesting people at the pub. The Tory establishment here holds a vice-like grip on all levels of power in the media, and the experience of the Labour member is one of stigma, hopelessness and isolation. And the difficult driving and hours of travel involved in participating in any organised Labour Party activity have been prohibitive, really. So when we hear from the party since the general election about the need for getting involved in our communities, community organising and local leadership, presents a bit of a challenge, really, in constituencies like ours. And scratching under the surface of our organisation here in the Labour Party, in our constituency, it becomes apparent that we're sort of ridiculously centralised, really, with all avenues leading to the secretary, who can have no conceivable hope of directing activity in our 24 wards, 60 parishes and 120 villages. We lack a Labour Party staff organiser, and beyond that, there's really just a regional director whose attention is rightly directed at winning seats in odd large towns and cities. But perhaps most critical, without rural district councillors and rural county councillors across the whole of Devon, we frankly lack the competence and capability about the practicalities of running higher local tier local government, let alone aspiring to represent the constituency in Westminster, in which we're doing, making great strides, really, with the results we've had since 2015. But to address the centralisation in our Devon constituency, we've invested in a project called Labour Neighbours, which proactively creates informal opt-in grassroots member communities in each of our 24 wards. With just half an hour of member engagement calls a day by somebody proactive, it's possible to speak to 500 to 1,000 members in 6 months. And with personalised engagement, these parish-based networks are beginning to empower dormant members to gently emerge as party and community activists, and allow us to develop our local understanding at the village level of what's important to residents, so that we begin to message and speak to them about what's really important in their daily lives. We must come out of hiding in rural areas and begin to engage in the fabric of our rural areas. And yes, we have no higher rural representation, but we do have town and parish councillors in Devon, and they're ideally placed to do the community organising the party wants us to do, but are almost entirely under the radar, with zero organisation, training, briefing, support or recognition within the party. We must empower and organise our parish councillors. So I'm going to hand over now to our panellists. We have Griffith, MP and Shadow Welsh Secretary, Jessie Jo Jacobs, Mayoral candidate for Tees Valley, Colin Smyth, MSP and Shadow Rural Economy, Transport and Connectivity Secretary, and Wes Streeting MP, Shadow Exchequer Secretary. So over to you, Nia.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and I hope everybody can hear all right. I'm Nia Griffith, I'm the Shadow Wales Secretary, and obviously we have many rural constituencies, but the problems are very, very similar right across the UK. And as we've heard, Labour is very, very committed to responding to those challenges: housing, transport, broadband, mobile connectivity, and obviously we're very clear that we don't want farming to be threatened by lower standards of imports, and our farmers obviously trying to keep up the high welfare standards we have. So there's plenty of work going on to respond to those challenges, but we must absolutely improve our messaging. Just in the same way as I like all of our shadow cabinet members to reference Wales and Scotland, we should also be referencing rural areas whenever we speak, not just Luke Pollard because he's DEFRA, but all of us, and mentioning, you know, High Peak and Pembrokeshire as opposed to just London and Manchester. And the same goes for the graphics that are produced, all the wonderful things that we get sent. Again, we need to make sure that we've got, just as we all know that thing, you know, you've got to have someone like you to inspire you. It's got to be somewhere like where I live to make people feel that we've got a message for them. So in terms of dealing with our own constituencies, of course, members are absolutely key. First and foremost, they are our resource, our fantastic resource in our constituencies. And I was very, very glad to hear our chair explain how she's been involved in that member mobilisation, because obviously members have had very different experiences of COVID. Some have been rushing about as key workers, some have been juggling home working and family, and some have been very isolated, and different constituencies have made very different use of things like Zoom. So what sort of resources do we need? Well, first and foremost, let's give our members the best. You can invite anybody to speak now. It always used to be, well, we'll never get, you know, anyone from the shadow cabinet to come this far, etc., etc., etc. But do get in touch and ask. Doesn't matter where you are, and it is absolutely fantastic to be able to speak to people all over the place just at the press of a button. It really is, and it's great for members obviously to be able to ask the questions that they want to ask and get the feedback. Look, we all know it's very hard going. We're in opposition nationally, and many of the constituencies represented today are in areas where they're not going to be able to win a Labour majority on the local council. But every Labour council matters, and every Labour win matters. And even with very, very small numbers, you can actually make some difference, influence, and try and be a catalyst for change in your area. So we are, I'm sure, all been very busy doing making our target list of target seats and getting candidates selected, and we've got some fantastic people I know, and many have been involved in many voluntary activities over the COVID. So what do we want back from Labour Party nationally? Well, the report that came out on the 2019 election identified two very clear needs. One is about how do we identify the target groups of voters that will make up that coalition that can bring us a Labour victory, and the other is the whole issue of skills. So I think that one of the things we definitely need is we need a lot of training for our members. Lots of people use social media, but we can all improve, and we all know, you know, there are lots of different ways that we can find out how to, you know, target particular groups and what particular messaging works and so forth. But we all need a lot more training on that. Now, organisers, in an ideal world, of course, we all want our own organiser, you know, but we all know very clearly that that is not going to happen for all of our rural constituencies. But I think we need a new model of organiser, and to work in a slightly different way. Let's recognise that organisers can have skills, they can be upskilled as much as possible, and that actually driving around the country was not a terribly good use of their time. So I still think every constituency should have a named organiser that they refer to, and that organiser should be linked into a regional team, obviously a regional office. But
Thanks, Leah.
Clearly, oh, sorry, can I?
If you don't mind, we'll come back later with some questions, but if you don't mind, I'm gonna hand over now to Jessie Jo Jacobs.
Okay, I only had about two sentences to say, but anyway, carry on.
Oh.
Hi everyone. Yeah, really pleased to be here. Sorry, Lee, I'm sure we'll build on that conversation, and it was really, really fascinating to sort of hear it from that national perspective. And my first observation really is, even in this conference, this would never have been possible. The range of speakers geographically, to be, and attendees to be able to come to a conference like this before COVID would never have happened, and it's been really challenging times, but the pace of what we've been able to embrace technology to do things like this, I think can only have positive impacts on how we campaign and what we do in the future. And I'm going to share a little bit about that in some of my thoughts. And a good example of this in how the world has expanded and we can do things remotely is I'm Tees Valley's candidate for Metro Mayor, and actually I'm representing the coastal communities. I'm a surfer. And my camper van became a little bit of a remote office during lockdown, because suddenly I didn't have to be in an office in the town. I could be out and about and going into communities and in different ways, and being able to speak to people from my laptop, from my mobile phone, and what that affords us is like Nia said, that actually we can now connect across geographical spaces that we never could. And I think for rural communities, we absolutely know how valuable that is going to be, but how do we tap into it, and how do we really maximise our ability to use digital? Now, even before the COVID crisis, I was talking very much, my campaign was going to be a digital first campaign. Mayoral elections tend to get even less than local election turnout. We're talking about 22% turnout if we're lucky, and those voters and how we engage with them and how we get them to turn out, we've got to be able to use digital. And so for me, I have become obsessed with data, and sorry if for some people I'll be speaking your language, and for other people this might be a million miles away from where you are. My background is in campaigns. I used to run a charity, place regeneration projects, and also a big fundraiser. And for us in the charity sector, we would be obsessed with data because we knew that data meant funds. We knew that if we could get a mobile phone number, we were much more likely to be able to get donations to our work. And I think we need to be the same in terms of campaigning. Getting a mobile number should be like getting the air that we breathe, in that if we can get a mobile number, then we can start to use things like text the vote out. We're going to use this in my campaign. So on the day of elections, instead of having to try and get round every single door, and because mine's a mayoral election, I've got 7 constituencies, half of those are rural, and we will not get the type of campaigners and numbers that we do in a general election. So it's vital that we have a way to get the vote out digitally. So we're going to do a text the vote out. So everyone we meet during our campaign, we will get mobile numbers for, and we need to find out ways of collecting that data. We also want to experiment with digital door knocking, mobilising our members, instead of knocking on a door, to message 10 friends, to ask them, how are you voting? Getting people to complete surveys. If your friend says, please would you fill this survey in for me if I'm campaigning for Jessie Jacobs, they'll be much more likely than some stranger. So even if we can get all of our members to get 20 surveys completed, that's 3,000 members times 20, that we're talking about a lot of people and a lot of new data.
Thanks very much, Jessie.
Yeah,
sorry.
That was fine. That was it. I've got some stuff on policy, but I can come back to that in questions.
Great. So I wonder if we can hand over to Colin, our Shadow Rural Economy, Transport and Connectivity Secretary.
Yeah, thank you very much, Liz, and greetings to everyone from Scotland. It is great to be joining you at the conference, and I have to say I've really enjoyed all the debates so far. As Liz says, I have the privilege of being Scottish Labour spokesperson for the rural economy, transport and connectivity, which are probably the 3 subjects that sum up my constituents' inbox every week, given the fact that I also have the privilege of being a regional member of the Scottish Parliament for the south of Scotland, which stretches from Ayrshire on the west coast right across to the borders on the east. And you've kindly asked me to say a few words about winning in Scotland in 2021, which is obviously a very easy subject for a Saturday morning. And I'm going to be frank, because I do think where we are in Scotland does show the scale of the challenge we face as a party. I don't need to tell anyone here that we're not in government in Scotland, and most of you will know that we are not even in second place anymore. The first Scottish Parliament election back in 1999, we had nearly 40% of the vote, securing first place and having 53 constituency MSPs and 3 regional list MSPs. In 2016, our vote had nearly halved, and we secured just 3 constituency MSPs and 21 regional MSPs, and we fell into third spot. And if we think we've fallen as far as we can, the bad news is that the current polls do have us on between 14% and 17%. And I just want to reflect on this. If we fall below 15 MSPs, the party of Donald Dewar would no longer be entitled to ask a question every week at First Minister's question times. Now, that decline hasn't happened overnight, and the reasons are obviously varied and complex. But the immediate challenge we obviously have is probably the reason, the sharpest decline post 2014, and that's the extent to which the debate on independence utterly dominates political debate in Scotland. I suspect there's no one at this conference today who came into politics because of the Constitution, and our voters are the same. So what that means is that when it comes to views on the Constitution, the Labour vote is split. We lose pro-independence voters to the SNP, and we lose pro-union voters to the Conservatives. And if we thought that the current pandemic would reduce the importance of the constitutional debate, the SNP have been very clever. They've shaped the debate on the handling of the pandemic as a comparison between the Scottish Government and the UK Government. Nicola Sturgeon versus Boris Johnson, independence versus a UK Government. So I think our challenge in the next 9 months is, yes, we have to settle our view on the Constitution, but it is to appeal to those voters for whom the independence question is not the most important issues. At a time we'll be in the centre of an economic tsunami, and we need to show those pragmatic voters who live in every part of Scotland, who put financial security, jobs, public services, climate change at the top of the priorities, and not necessarily their views on the Constitution. We need to show them that we're on their side and we have the policies for them. And crucially, those voters live in every part of Scotland, north and south, urban and rural. And because the battleground at this election in May for Labour will be largely on the regional list vote, and we have a proportional representation system when it comes to those elections, it means that a Labour vote in the Highlands will be just as important as a Labour vote in the centre of Dundee. Now, I think there's a small window of opportunity between now and May to make a difference, to fight back, and the votes of people in rural communities are going to be hugely important to that. So our campaign organisation and our resources need to reflect that. Crucially, we need to set out those clear policies that will make a difference to those communities. We can't rest on our comfort zone of just talking about cities all the time. So, for example, it's about reversing those bus service cuts that have hit rural communities hard, showing people that our proposal for a national care service will make a difference to the care of older people in rural communities, and showing that our jobs guarantee will make a difference to those communities who have been hit hardest by the economic side of the pandemic, and that is rural Scotland. Because in finishing off, Liz, this election is not only going to be vital to the party in Scotland, but winning back in Scotland is obviously going to be absolutely vital to getting Keir into number 10 at the next general election.
Thanks very much, Colin. And here. Sorry, could we pass over to Wes?
Yeah, good morning. Thanks very much for having me along. And I totally agree with what Jessie Joe said about, you know, one of the few good things to come out of this miserable period in our history is that it has made people taking to Zoom meetings like this, you know, it's almost become second nature. That's not to say, by the way, that there aren't lots of party members, particularly older members, and people who don't have very good access to IT at home, who are excluded. So it's not a substitute for real life meetings, but it certainly makes conversations like this one that bit easier. I think I just wanted to say 2 things, and I've got my timer on so I don't run over 4 minutes. The first is about policy and the second is about organisation, and obviously there's a big relationship between the two. One of the reasons why sort of frankly Labour MPs need to spend a lot of time talking to members and voters in seats that aren't currently Labour, is that there are lots of challenges, lots of issues that won't necessarily come as second nature to MPs who represent big urban areas. I mean, I'm on the London-Essex border, and I look as much out towards Essex as into London. But unless we get our policies in the right place and our message in the right place, the job of organising becomes even more difficult. We want to make sure that when Labour members are out knocking on doors and talking to voters, wherever they are in the country, it's with policies, ideas and a message that will reflect the concerns of local voters. So that really necessitates a two-way conversation and requires Labour MPs to be listening to you as much as talking to you. I mean, with that in mind, I mean, obviously in the Shadow Treasury team, I kind of cover what I would describe as the sort of the real economy, a really wide range of issues. So I spend lots of time talking to stakeholders, including those in rural communities like the National Farmers Union being an obvious example. And I want to make sure that the issues we're raising in the Shadow Treasury team in particular are reflective of the whole country. In particular, making sure that when we're talking about an economic recovery, that we're not talking about a return to business as usual, but building back better, and with policies and ideas that involve building back better for every part of the country. I think you guys in Labour Coast and Country have been doing a great job already in terms of making sure that issues around connectivity, particularly transport services for rural and remote areas, broadband connectivity are higher on the agenda. Things like losing bank branches, cash machines matter a lot more to rural communities, and that's a priority for us. We've got to be serious as a party about devolving power and resources to every part of the country. And I think that has got to be reflected in our party organisation as well. I recognise, especially having won a seat from the Tories in 2015 with a majority of just 589, the importance of actually going out, knocking on doors and maintaining strong connections with voters, but absolutely recognise some of the comments we've already seen this morning in the box and things we picked up, that if you live in a constituency that doesn't have a Labour MP, doesn't have a big local government base, and particularly if you're in a geographically vast constituency, some of those challenges can be a lot more difficult. So I think we've got to think really smartly about the seats that we're targeting and look at the map of the country afresh. There's been lots of demographic change, and there will be lots of areas of the country where Labour turning up will be a novelty for lots of people and hopefully a pleasant surprise. But thinking about how we resource organisation and support is going to be really important. The final thing I just want to say with my final 10 seconds is I am very happy to get out and about around the country. So just because you're not a target seat or you don't have a Labour MP, don't hesitate to drop me a line if you'd like me to come and do a visit at some point. So I'd be really happy to do that.
So thanks very much, everyone. That was really covered a lot there. And now we're going to take some questions. So hope everyone can be ready to answer. I've got a straightforward one to Jessie. Have you found it difficult to get voters to hand over their numbers?
Oh yeah, so it has to be coupled with campaigning and issue-based campaigning. So yeah, if I was out on the street asking for their mobile number so I can get them to vote for me, it would be very difficult. But we did things like a bus campaign. So buses are a really important part of my campaign, and so therefore we're out on the high streets where we were before COVID, and we'll do this digitally, where we will ask people to sign a petition for better buses. And in the petition you give your mobile number, you give your email address, and you tick a box, GDPR regulated, to say you're happy for us to contact you again. And they've got a choice to be contacted about transport issues or about wider campaign issues and what I'm going to do for the Tees Valley. So you have, as long as you've got a good reason to collect a mobile number. What we haven't tried yet is door knocking, and when we get a Labour a Labour promise, to actually ask for a mobile number on the doorstep. We were thinking about that, and then COVID happened, so we'll potentially see what that looks like. But I think we also need to explore the possibilities of whether we're able to purchase mobile data as well, because I think I used it in the Stronger In campaign. So I presume it's possible, but we're having those conversations nationally as well.
Thanks very much. So I think we're trying to, thanks, that was perfect, but trying to keep our responses to about 1 minute. Right, Nia, do you think that sometimes the Tory government gets too much credit for things the Welsh Labour government has done, like the furlough scheme?
I think it's extremely difficult. I think what the COVID-19 has done has actually given quite a high profile to our First Minister, Mark Drakeford. People have actually noticed that things can be different in Wales. So, but it's still very, very confusing for lots of people to know which things are devolved and which are not. And as you say, it's far too easy for the Tories to take credit for all sorts of things. So yes, I mean there is a problem. There is a communication issue that we have to we have to face up to.
Thanks very much. So we're going to have about a minute each for the panelists at the end, but I'm just pressing on with the questions. So Colin, does it make sense to reallocate party funds to rural areas from ultra-safe city seats?
I think the challenge we have in Scotland, Liz, is that there will be votes because of the proportional representation system and the fact that the battleground for us in Scotland is on the regional list. Then a vote in the centre of Glasgow is important, but so is a vote in the centre of where I live in Dumfries or in rural communities nearby. So the challenge we have is that how do we organise to make sure that we're out knocking on those doors or communicating with voters in every part of Scotland, and that is a real difficulty we have. So it is equally important that we have organisation in place in rural communities where maybe we're not as strong as it is in our cities, and we need to get away from the sort of default position of a comfort zone of only focusing on our cities and getting out and about in rural areas. But the challenge is that a vote in every part of Scotland is going to be incredibly important in the election next May.
Thanks very much. So now I'm going to ask Cornelius to Oliver, who's got a question.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. We're near neighbours down in West Cornwall. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was very interested in what Jessie was saying about digital campaigning. Though speaking from West Cornwall, I'm sceptical about the potential for surfing in the northeast of England. But I need to know more about digital campaigning, and I want to know more about digital campaigning. But I wanted to make a plea for in rural areas like Cornwall, small town rural areas. Traditional campaigning, traditional media still works. Local newspapers and local radio stations have a great deal of participation. Regional TV shows. Something like 20% of the population in Cornwall spends at least 2 hours a week listening to Radio Cornwall. The sort of permeation of the local newspaper in Penzance, which I represent on Cornwall Council, is about 40%. Now, you only have to go to Plymouth or Exeter and you get much less influence in local media. So all I'm saying is when we focus on digital media, don't give up on the traditional stuff. Older voters, the people who are more likely to vote in local elections, read the letter columns of the local newspaper, all that stuff. So I do think it's about finding a balance very much. I haven't got that balance. I'm too traditional, but don't give up on the old school stuff is all I wanted. That's not really a question, but I wondered if Jessie would agree with me to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We have to engage with our local press and building great relationships with local journalists. But what I would also say is that there is also local Facebook groups, and again, it's still digital, but you'd be amazed at even the sort of the age and span who are using Facebook, and Facebook groups are often now a source of people's news and information, as well as the traditional news. So you definitely can't have one without the other. But I do think we've focused historically very much on traditional organising, and we just need to catch up with digital.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to just hand over now to David Littlefair, if you want to unmute yourself to ask your question.
Yeah, sorry. So I didn't realise I'd be unmuted for this. I was just going to ask the panel. I've I've been going to Labour conference quite a long time now, and you tend to find that any kind of coastal country issue seems to be really, really niche. And I suppose, you know, the only reason I'm sort of aware of it is maybe because, I mean, one, I come from the northeast of England, and I live in London now, so I've been part of a kind of coastal city in some ways. But I do think that, you know, everything that I've seen in kind of conferences and stuff like that seems to be not especially well attended, and not, you know, not really treated as a major issue. So I was wondering about how we kind of make the wider membership, especially where I live at the moment, which is in Lewisham, where you know, which is a major Labour city part of London and has an enormous membership. You know, how we make those groups more aware of the needs of coastal and rural communities.
Nia, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I think you make a very good point, because obviously it makes an awful lot of discussion very urban centric. I think certainly obviously today is great, and what Labour Coast and Country do at conference is great. But as you say, it does tend to be pushed to one corner and only the people that are from those areas go there, sort of thing. So what we've got to do, it's messaging again, isn't it? It's about getting out the messages to everybody in all of our messaging, that we want to include everybody, including, you know, coastal and country areas, and you know, definitely making sure that, you know, those are clear, strong messages.
Thanks very much. I've got a question from Dylan Tippett.
Hi, I'm just wondering how we improve youth representation in the rural and coastal policy debate, because in my CLP I'm only one of 2 active young members, and I know on a lot of rural policy groups that I'm on Facebook, a lot of members seem to be over 30. So I was wondering how we improve young Labour engagement, especially digitally, because that tends to be our skill set.
Is that something, well, maybe I'm going to go to Wes because he hasn't.
I thought you were going to say you're coming to me because I look the youngest. Never mind. I think that's a really great question, Dylan, actually. And you're right about the sort of the way in which younger members, I think, are more digitally connected often than older members. And there's a real opportunity there, actually, to get more young people involved and to feel welcome. It can be a bit, you know, I still remember my first constituency Labour Party meeting where I was the only young member in the room. And although I was made to feel welcome by other members, you know, that can be very intimidating. So kind of providing a warm welcome to the Labour Party and providing forums where young members can connect. I mean, that's worked really well in my borough, where we've got a really active young Labour group who you know, they started off as a network for each other, but are now a real organising strength for us. So I, you know, strongly endorse what you've said. And one of the things I'm sort of raising with the party is the need to properly resource young Labour and our student organisation as well, which is sort of, for all sorts of reasons, has sort of collapsed a bit. So, you know, I think watch this space, and I think, you know, a lot of these organising issues we're raising, whether young members or more generally, we'll make sure are fed back to Angela Rayner as well, who's doing a lot of work on party organisation at the moment as our party chair and campaign and sort of national campaigns lead.
Thanks very much. That's important. Yeah, it's, I've asked Paul to come in with a question on the NEC.
Hi, can you hear me all?
Yeah.
I think without rural representation on the NEC, Labour will still be seen as a metropolitan party, because it's basically metropolitan members that seem to be voted every year. And when they think about rules and how we organise ourselves, they think about, you know, urban areas, densely populated, where it's really easy for members to meet. And like our CLP, which is 160 square miles, I think, and it's really difficult for us to meet. And before Zoom, it was nearly impossible. You know, we have 500 or 600 members, but you maybe have to drive an hour to go to a meeting, which is not really sustainable. So without representation on the NEC, which understands our problems, we will be continue just to be an urban party.
Colin, do you want to come back on that? Because Scotland's had this issue until quite recently.
We certainly did. It was, you know, for a long period of time, there was no representation from Scotland on the NEC. Just simply from pragmatic points of view, we don't have a large membership base in Scotland, and anyone standing from Scotland tended to get votes from Scotland, but very rarely elsewhere, apart from a couple of occasions. But we do have that change where we do have a place there from the leader on the NEC, and I think that's incredibly important. I really do think stressing the importance of Scotland, not just to people in Scotland at the next election, but actually to the party right across the whole of the UK, and actually to the very future of the UK. If I'm being perfectly frank, these elections will play a large role in whether or not, as I said earlier, Keir is in number 10 at the next election, but they'll actually play an important role as to whether or not we're going to face another independence referendum and the potential consequence of that for the whole of the UK. So the more positions from Scotland on the NEC, putting that message across, the better, I think.
Okay, Amy, do you want to come in with your question about membership fees? Amy, okay. Saxon, are you asking to speak? Saxon, you'll need to unmute. Hold on.
Yes.
Thanks. Saxon, you're muted again.
Am I muted?
You're good now. No. Saxon, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, I'd like to pick up the point about the inflexibility of the NEC and its rules. You will remember that many of our constituencies in Devon were very frustrated before the general election in not being able to elect their parliamentary candidates. And therefore they were in a very poor position for campaigning. And we have the same problem now in Devon, as you know very well. We did 52 virtual interviews for our selection of panel of candidates very successfully, but now we're not able to go ahead with selections because the winnable seats in Exeter have to be dealt with first, and they don't recognise how important it is to be able to, in places like Bideford or Axminster, that we do need to have local candidates, and that needs to be unblocked.
Wes, do you want to come back on that?
It's I mean, it is difficult. The party's sort of trying to, get its practices, which, are often well defined in terms of the rule book, adapted to sort of fit the circumstances. And I think it sounds to me, particularly what you said about, selecting the Exeter candidates, that part of this is about resources of party staff, and making sure that, that we're prioritising the sort of the target seats and the more winnable seats first. But I think it's something to raise with your regional office, and maybe we need to be a bit more flexible, so that seats like yours and areas like yours can just sort of get on with it.
Okay, I've got a question from Brenda Weston in Taunton.
Hi Liz, it's picking up on what a previous speaker said. We don't have representation of the regions on the National Executive Committee, and I think that's a sort of democratic problem in itself, but I think it also means that the sorts of rules that we've had coming through the rule change recently have been very much focused on mass parties in metropolitan areas, because there's no real understanding about how difficult it is, as some people have referred to get to party meetings for members. And I think Zoom's a great boot, but it's not a replacement for a proper party meeting. And if you can't get the quorum that that we're required to get, you just don't have a viable party. So I think there's a connection. The REC, the NEC needs to represent the regions in England.
Jessie, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, just
Zoom versus.
I think it was just to come on a wider perspective. Like we've got to face the fact that our party is very city and London. It has been, at times been city and London centric, and but it's not just about NEC. It's all of our structures. It's where policies are made. It's where our advisors live and work and see. You know, if I think about the policies at the moment that are really important here, what's happening with planning and the fact that we can now see huge swathes of housing. If you are near a green belt or a contested area, that is absolutely, people are fighting now and seeing that how detrimental that is to rural communities. And the same with the stamp duty holiday. If you live in a place where you've got housing that is being snapped up for second homes, it's completely taking people out of the housing market. But if you live in the city and you're not seeing how important and dynamite those policies are, then they're never going to be at the forefront. So I would say that we have to have a root and branch look at how we shape policy to ensure that rural and coastal communities are prioritised, because there is no places that we can't win if we have the right policies.
Hear, hear. So I'm going to hand over back to Nia if you want to bring in those points that I cut you off earlier.
Oh yes, I mean, I just wanted to clarify. I think I put it in the chat group anyway. The vision of the organiser is not that we don't have them, but that we have them doing a different role. We have them linking into a number of different constituencies from a distance. I used to hate the fact they never came out of Cardiff and I couldn't get them to Pembrokeshire. But actually, if we use their skills properly and we use them for training us and we use them into networking the experts so that we can each get that analysis of our local area that we need of those target voters, and that we then upskill our members. But we all need a kick. They need to monitor us. They need to keep us in our constituencies on our toes, and watching what we're doing, and asking for report backs and target setting and all the rest of it. But I see it much more as a managerial thing now, and I think that's a way forward for us, rather than being the person with the board out with your members on a Saturday morning and having driven this amount and that amount. That's not really using the skills that we should be looking for in our organisers to the full effect. So that's I just wanted to say that little bit, that's all.
Okay, over to you, Jessie. Do you want to wrap up for a minute or two?
Yeah, great. I guess I just want to end by saying that we can and we will win in rural communities. The Tories are attritioning support at the moment because of farming, because of food, because of Brexit, fishing, planning, housing. They are making all the wrong decisions, and they are taking for granted their rural support. And I think the Red Wall and the loss of the Red Wall last year was horrendous for us. But if we can take any sort of encouragement, if there's places, we used to think there was places that we wouldn't and couldn't lose. But we have seen that we can, but we also need to think there are places that where we've thought we could never win in, and people can shift their traditional vote. And if the Tories are ignoring the voice of rural communities in the way that they seem to be at the moment, there is ground for us to take. So if we have the right policies, if we have the right campaigning tools, we can and we will win. And I hope that you'll all help me win next year in the Tees Valley.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Colin.
Thanks very much, Liz. I just want to make the point again. We obviously do face a big challenge in Scotland next May, and I don't think I can underestimate the scale of that challenge, what it means for the party, not just in Scotland and the Scottish Parliament, but actually what it means for the party across the UK. The road back to number 10 at UK level will need to run through Scotland, and unless we can win again in Scotland, it will be difficult to win again at a UK general election, and demands for that further independence referendum will grow. I mean, the biggest threat to the UK isn't necessarily Nicola Sturgeon, but it's actually having Boris Johnson remain in number 10. And crucially, because the voting system we have in the Scottish Parliament elections is a proportional system, and the battleground is a regional list battleground for Labour, the votes of people in rural communities are actually going to be more important next May than they've ever been before. So that means we need to, to shake off our sort of comfort zone and focus on those rural communities, on the issues that I think other parties often neglect, like bus services, rural poverty, what's happening to some of our fishing communities. Unless we focus on those, if we focus on those issues, I think there is a way back for Labour in Scotland. It's a slow way back, but I do think it's possible. And as I say, the votes of rural communities will be really important at that election.
Fantastic. So Wes.
Yeah, just a few things in sort of conclusion. I think the points made about the case for regional representation on the NEC are very well made. I've supported that for some time now. I think it would make a big difference. I also, in terms of picking up these points about rural poverty and fuel poverty, I mean, you would think from listening to Conservative MPs representing rural areas, and sometimes by the way the Labour Party talks about these areas, that they're all kind of lovely green leafy areas where everything's bright and rosy and everyone's having a great time. And I think that really does overlook the enormous inequality in our country. Not just enormous regional inequality, but significant pockets of poverty in every part of Britain, and that's got to be reflected in the work that we do, the way in which we challenge the Conservatives to actually represent those areas. There's one thing we haven't discussed. Is one of the consequences of the collapse of the Liberal Democrats is that it will make it harder to remove the Tories from government in seats where they've it's traditionally been a Lib Dem Tory marginal. And I think, the Labour Party has a responsibility now to step into those places, to be visible, to be present. And again, picking up some of the points in the comments, if Labour is out there, if Labour is visible, and if we're giving those communities the confidence that we're serious about winning their trust and support, and that we are best placed to remove the Tories, we may find ourselves unlocking a significant number of anti-Tory votes in seats that have traditionally been Tory Lib Dem marginals. And frankly, if the Lib Dems can't get their act together, and I hold no candle for the Lib Dems, so I don't really care about the Lib Dem revival. I'd much rather see Labour MPs than Lib Dem MPs anyway. But let's start afresh and let's try and win back support in those communities. And as I said, my door, always feel free to use me as a point of contact with Labour's shadow Treasury team. I want to make sure that our policies are in the right place. And you'll be hearing more from Luke later on in the conference about the work he's doing as Shadow DEFRA Secretary in particular, to make sure that rural communities aren't forgotten and are at the forefront of our policy thinking and our work in Parliament. But it's been great to join you today, so thanks for having me.
So thanks very much. So that's been incredibly good feedback from the panelists on the questions we've had. Certainly, I think I'm going to be tabling a question for us down here in Devon on what we can do as a party to help the cause in Scotland, because that seems very important. And I've been very gratified to have both Scotland and Wales represented on this panel. Coming back to that point just now on the what we can do on the economy, just the rural economy is very different and than the kind of economy that we tend to talk about in the Labour Party. And here in the Southwest we have massive amount of self-employment, and I think 95% of our rural businesses are micro businesses, so less than 10 employees. And I think we need to just message, to those constituents quite strongly, really. And my experience as an organiser here in Devon is that using the parish and the town Facebook groups to put messages that don't necessarily come across as traditionally Labour, to do with supporting small businesses through grant funding that's available, just amplifying those messages, and also championing the National Farmers Union's campaigns, just allows us to position ourselves as the friend of the small business person and the self-employed in a way that perhaps we haven't traditionally been seen. And that's what I would like to just close with here, is just using the power of Facebook. Yes, we've got reach and the paid Facebook advertising and targeted campaigning that is a big part of our tool set, but also just using that free organic sharing of material into Facebook groups, especially if we can make our message, if we can go and use the public question time in the district council meetings, speak on something about Honiton, and then share what we've said specifically about Honiton, standing up for Honiton, into the Honiton Facebook group. That really, I find, gets a terrific response from the public, and positions us as with some power beyond what we've achieved perhaps through the polls.